Hello everybody. So I wanted to today talk about how Australians make sure that we have fair trials in this country. Now, we're not perfect and we don't claim to be. Other countries are not perfect either. Other countries have different laws and that's okay. Maybe their laws are better, maybe ours are better, maybe they're just different. I'm not going to argue that. Of course, being Australian myself, I am going to preference my own laws, or at least have a very strong opinion about them. If I think they're wrong, I'm probably going to think they're the worst in the world, and if I think they're right, I'm probably going to think they're the best in the world. And that tends to be how they work, because I have lived through this. Now, the issue here is, and I want to specify this related to the mushroom trial, is that a lot of people have raised some concerns, and they said, well, because it's in the media so much, not just in Victoria, but also interstate and also overseas, how can they be sure that Erin Patterson gets a fair trial? How can we be sure that she's found guilty if she is guilty and that she's found not guilty if she is not guilty? And the simple answer to that is that we have, in Australia, we have a rule so that the jury must be people who have not heard of the case. So in a case which has been in the media, they must always pick jurors who, as the most important factor, that they have never heard the case. So when the jury are being selected, they'll be asked questions related, by both prosecution and defence, related to whether or not they've heard of the case. If they've heard of the case, they must honestly say so, and then they will almost certainly be removed. Sometimes I'll let them in if they've heard a little bit, but not enough to bias them. But both defence and prosecution, and also the judge, can remove as many people as they like if they genuinely think that they're biased. So it's not like they have a limit, they can only say no to 3 people or something. If it's for that reason, they can say no to everybody. And if it's a case where everybody in the community knows, then the trial can be held in a different community. And if indeed everybody in the whole state knows about it and is biased, or they will move it to a different state. And there's even been cases where they've moved them to a different country. So for example, Australia has some overseas territory, and we also have countries that are friendly to us who have held court cases by Australian law in their own country. For example, we did hold a case in Papua New Guinea a few years ago, trying to think which one it was, but it was one that was so much in the media that they didn't believe that they could find jurors anywhere in Australia who could report on it fairly. So we had the option to do that in the mushroom murder trial. They could have decided to hold it in, for example, Papua New Guinea, and I think there's Christmas Island and a few other little island territories that either Australia own or are very friendly with, and they have agreed to hold different trials, because people in Papua New Guinea probably wouldn't have heard of this case. Partially because they probably don't get us very much Australian news, but then again, because this is in international news, they might have. But they're probably still less likely than someone in Australia. So you could probably have a trial in Papua New Guinea to make sure of it. Now, they decided not to do that for this case. Now, I think this probably was a trial that was significant enough that they should have considered that, and I don't know the level of how much they considered it. They may have considered it and decided, no, we were okay here in Australia, or they may have not considered it because they didn't think it was that severe. But either way, that is an option. And they could have had it interstate, they could have had it, for example, in the Northern Territory or Western Australia or somewhere a long way away from Victoria, or they could have simply had it somewhere outside of that community. Now, they've decided to have it in Morwell, which is, as far as I know, the nearest Supreme Court to where the people died, which was Leongatha. So they decided to have it locally. Now, is that a good idea or not? I can debate that. I don't know the whole arguments about it. There would have been a whole series of arguments about whether or not to have them in Morwell. I'd imagine that the defence would probably object to it, but the prosecution probably would say they wanted it to be held in the community. Now, an argument by the prosecution could have been along the lines of, well, it's actually probably better known outside of Morwell than it is inside of Morwell. And they also may have wanted to have people that actually are familiar with the area and that know the ins and outs. So for example, if they held it in Melbourne, in the city, there may have been people that don't understand the country way of life. So for example, one issue is that in a country area such as Leongatha, people tend to leave their doors open. So it'd be quite easy for somebody to come in with a group of death cap mushrooms and just put them in somebody's fridge and replace them with... So somebody might be keeping regular edible mushrooms in their fridge and you could just easily replace them with death cap mushrooms. Now, I haven't seen that argument in the various news sources, but if I was somebody that lived out remote in Leongatha, I would know that, whereas I'd know that was a possibility. Whereas somebody that's in the city, that's never lived in the country area, might think, well, that's just a stupid argument because people, of course, lock and bolt their doors and wouldn't allow that. Because you see, that's a different attitude. So there is merit to having it in somewhere close to that community because people would understand the dynamics, even if they don't know the case. So you would understand the normal dynamics of people in that sort of situation. And you wouldn't get that if you had it in Melbourne, you wouldn't get that if you had it interstate, and you wouldn't get that if you had it in overseas, in, for example, Papua New Guinea. So they need to balance that out. They need to decide, okay, you're going to get some bias if you have it in your local community, but you're also going to get some accuracy, and they need to weigh that up. And the one that needs to weigh that up is the judge. Now, obviously, if the prosecution feels that she's going to get an unfairly good deal in that area, then they're going to object. But most commonly, the people that are going to object to it being held in their local community is the defence. So I would have expected that the defence would have objected. The defence might not have objected, but I would think that the defence would at least consider objecting. I don't know if they did or not, because that would be, those kind of discussions are held behind closed doors and they're never allowed to be in the media. So the media wouldn't be allowed in while they're having those sorts of discussions, not usually at least. And I have no indication that the defence, the media were allowed in during those discussions. So the other thing that we do, so we have, the juries are required to not be aware of the case. So they must know either nothing about the case or as little as possible and not to have formed an opinion. So they would probably be asked a series of questions. Now the series of questions would probably be asked by a judge or someone appointed by the judge, because they would need to be a neutral person. So you wouldn't have the prosecution asking questions or the defence asking questions. You might, and if you did, it'd be both sides, because they both get to say no to jurors. But of course, if they say no to too many, then the judge might intervene and say, no, you can't say no to them, and blah, 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 blah. So there's all sorts of different rules and all sorts of things. There's no technical limit to how many people they can say no to for this kind of bias reason. So they can say no, they can have 50 jury candidates, and they only need to have 12 plus 2 reserves, so 14, and they can say no to all 50. And then they get a new round, they can say no to all of them, and so forth, and then put in an application and say, well, because we said no, then we need to have it somewhere else. And they have had that sort of thing happen. Again, it has happened where they've had trials in Papua New Guinea, and they've even had, of course, you don't always have to go through saying no to 50 people, saying no to 100, 200 people. Sometimes they just know that they're going to be saying no to them, so they don't bother going through that, because that's expensive. Well, not very expensive, but it wastes the court's time, you know, to spend a whole day going through 50 people and then saying no to all of them. So they might just say, preempt that and just say, well, we're going to hold it somewhere else. Now, once they're confident that they've got jurors who they believe, they're confident, both prosecution and especially defence, and also the judge, are confident that these people have not heard of the case, then they need to be confident that these people will not find out about the case. So what they do is they do something called a sequestering. So that means that they essentially keep them in a hotel, and they're usually not allowed home, and for the duration of the trial and the deliberations, they will not be allowed to talk to regular people. So they will not be allowed to have mobile phones or internets or anything like that. And they will get together with other jurors in an appropriate way and an appropriate time, and they will not be allowed to discuss what everybody else is saying about the case. So they're allowed to discuss the case amongst themselves within reason, and there will be instructions about how much they're allowed to discuss. Because officially they're not really meant to discuss it until after the case is completed, which happened today. So today the judge gave instructions, and then after that, then they're meant to get together and meet all day, every day, until they make a decision. So up until this point, there will be amounts that they're allowed to talk about the case with each other, but it will be controlled by the judge. And if they break that, like if they just say, oh, they're guilty, and try to convince each other when they haven't heard all the evidence, then they won't be allowed to do that. What they can do, and this will depend on the judge's instructions, but there might be that they will have a chat with each other to try to understand what one piece of evidence means. So, for example, let's say you have dehydrated, you would have a dehydrator to so her having a dehydrator is quite irrelevant. It doesn't make her look guilty, it doesn't make her look not guilty. And that kind of discussion could be held. Now they could also say, well, what about her disposing of it? And they could say, well, that does make her look guilty. And that's the kind of thing. They say, well, why would you dispose of it? Either because she's guilty, or he says guilty, or it could just be she's panicking. And have those two arguments, they may have a chat with each other to sort of understand that. Now that's again only if the judge allowed that. The judge might not allow it. But just to refresh their memory, because it is a 9-week long trial, and I suppose really 7 weeks of good evidence. So there was different statements, the judge's instructions and all that. But they may have like 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. sort of thing. That's a normal trial day. So let's say they finish at 4 p.m. and then they have a little break, have their dinner, and then they get together, let's say after dinner, 7:30 to 8:30, have an hour, and amongst themselves, in a private, secure place, they may have the option to discuss the case with each other for what happened during that day. And that could happen. Again, there would be rules about that by the judge, and they might not allow it. But they might, because in such a long case, you can get confused. And they may want to take notes, well, they're allowed to take notes as the trial goes, but they may want to compare the notes and ask each other what they think about each day. Now, that's allowed. There's nothing corrupt about that. Australian law is perfectly fine with that. If they're not, then the judge will say, no, you can't meet. But often they will allow a certain amount of meeting with each other so they can understand the evidence, and that's particularly for such a long trial. Now, the other thing is, so they have the rules for the jury, both the selection and also the behaviour, but also they have rules for the media itself. So the media itself are not, well, they're allowed to report on it, but only to a certain degree. So in some trials, you may be familiar, Court TV in America, they just show the whole trial, every little bit of it. And that's America. And occasionally we do have trials that they show some amount of live in Australia. I can't remember any, but I'm sure it's happened. And see, in America, and I know with the Puff Daddy case, for example, or PT as some people call it, that there's been jurors who have got YouTube channels and they are reporting every day as to what happened on YouTube, even though it's not shown live. That would not be allowed in Australia. So if you're on the jury, definitely can't even look at YouTube, let alone have your own YouTube channel and reporting on it. But there are people doing that about the Puff Daddy case, and by US law that's allowed. So USA takes a different view to what Australia does. The American system says, well, we want jurors to be aware of the whole evidence, not just what's in court, but also what's in the media. The Australian view is, well, no, the media can be biased. Just because it's popular doesn't mean it's accurate. So Australia takes the view that we don't trust the media, we don't trust what mob rule says, and so they separate that, and they separate the law from what mob rule is. Now my view of that is that I think the Australian system is better. It's not perfect, but I do like this version of it, this aspect. Now I know a lot of Americans will say, no, they should be able to listen to what the media is saying. There'll be people that will find something out that isn't noticed in the court. And it's all about getting the right verdict. Now, I can understand that argument and see merit to it, but I can also see that can become very corrupt. Again, I haven't followed the Puff Daddy case. I'm not going to comment on that. It's under American law. I'm very nervous about commenting on American law because it can be quite different to Australian law. So I do sometimes, but I haven't followed that one enough to be able to comment on it. But you'll notice I've only started commenting on the mushroom trial recently because I didn't follow it very much to start with. But anyway, so if this was done by American law, you would probably be having it live streamed. It's a pretty big trial after all, and you'd probably be having jurors that would have a YouTube channel and be talking about it every day, and they'd be meeting with press. They'd meet with the jury. They say, "Oh, you're juror number 7. How do you think the trial's going?" "Oh, I think they're guilty." In some cases, you have that sort of level in America. In Australia, if you even thought of doing that, it'd be illegal. In fact, in Australia, even after the trial's completed and they've had a verdict, the jury still aren't allowed to talk to the press. So if you've been a jury member on a trial, it doesn't matter what level of trial, and the press wants to talk to you about it, you're not allowed to talk about it. Now, you're not even meant to talk about it with a friend. You kind of can, as long as you keep it all completely anonymous and it never goes to the media, but you're technically not even allowed to talk with a friend. Jury, because then they get to discuss it, they get to go over it all, how they all feel about the whole thing. So is this a perfect system? Obviously it's not. I know in South Africa they actually don't have juries because they found that having juries, for example with the Oscar Pistorius case, if they had a jury, they would always be biased. Corruption that wouldn't exist if you just had judges. But then the problem is that some judges can be corrupt. And I think we've talked about the UK trial against Johnny Depp, or by Johnny Depp against the UK. And there are severe allegations, particularly after this trial, that judge in the UK trial was probably corrupt. I don't know that he definitely was, but I think that there's enough evidence to suggest that having a judge only determine the outcome of that trial may itself have been corrupt. And I think that's the reason why we have the jury. Because while we could have a judge, a single judge, make a determination that's expert, we can't ascertain whether that judge is fair and honest. And we have had corruption in Australia. We can get organised crime, we can get politicians, we can get other groups that will simply bribe or corrupt a judge. They might say to the judge, "You find this person guilty and we'll give him an million, or you find them not guilty and we'll give you $1 million. And you don't, if you find them guilty, we'll kill your family. Or, you know, there's different threats and intimidations that they can give to judges. And even though we'd like to think that judges can't be corrupted because of how long it takes for them to get to that level, we know from history that they can be. And this is why you have a jury. You have a jury to stop the potential corruption. This is in no way suggesting that the judge is corrupt. But so you have the expertise of the judges, and you have the fairness, hopefully, of the jury. Although, of course, there have been cases of jury members being corrupted by outside influences and being bribed and all that, the same way as judges can be in judge-only trials. So it is difficult to know how do you get a fair case. And the American system will say, or some versions of the American system will say, hey, look, just let everybody be aware of it, live stream the whole thing, and let everybody on the internet comment on it. That way you can get a fair case. And there is an argument towards that. So Australia doesn't take that view. We take the view that the media can be biased and that it's better off to keep the jury away from the jury. So if, for example, we were having this case purely based on what the average person on the jury thinks, who has been listening to the case and who has been following the media since she was first interviewed, I think it was by a Current Affair, most people would find her guilty. And that's without hearing any actual evidence, without the judges or the prosecution or the defence or anything like that. Most people would find her guilty. And I think if I ask people on the street, and I have asked people that I know, almost all of them find her guilty. So I think you'd be finding that if that was the case, the majority of people, the vast majority, I'd say 11 out of 12 if you're talking about jury members, would find her guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And that 12th one would probably be thinking, well, I'm not sure. And they would probably be overwhelmed, and so you would get a unanimous verdict of guilty. But the facts of the matter, and I talked about this in the George Pell case as well, the facts don't support a finding of guilty. Not just not to her beyond a reasonable doubt, but there's no doubt that she's not guilty. And this is where I think it's very important here in Australia that the jury asks the question that we do have this case. Now, obviously I don't know the outcome. It's possible she will still be found guilty. I'm not expecting it. I'm expecting a guilty verdict, but we'll see. And if she is found guilty, I would argue that that's because of the corruption. That hopefully doesn't happen. But that did happen in the George Pell case. And the George Pell case did have a similar level of media scrutiny, and it had a similar level of hatred towards the person who was accused, which in that case was George Pell. He was found guilty, but on appeal was reversed because the jury on the evidence couldn't have found him guilty. And that was proving that the media found him guilty when the law could not have. And that is a possibility in this case. I'm not saying I'm expecting it, but it is a possibility. She will be found not guilty. And I think that I hope that she does lodge an appeal, and I hope that it is successful. Because I think in Australian law it's really important to be focusing on facts, not on what the media says. Now, of course, if we open it up completely properly to the media, they might allow people to actually look at the actual facts of the case, like how impossible it is for her to have done this, and how she had absolutely no motive, which is extremely important. And not only did she have no motive, but it was counterproductive for her to do this. And, you know, it's just simply an impossible act. She couldn't have done it. So, in a similar way to how it was impossible for George Pell to have done the thing he was accused of, it's similarly because he couldn't have removed his robes. It was just simply impossible. I think that there was a case where he had 15 seconds to do something that would take 45 minutes. But the jury ignored that. In a similar way, for her to have cooked the 6 separate beef Wellingtons would take about 8 or 9 hours, and she had about 2.5 hours to do it. So it's just not possible to have done it. And that should be the nail in the coffin for this case. But it's unfortunately it's not, because of the media speculation and because the media haven't reported that bit. They've missed the vital bit. In the same way as the media didn't report in the George Pell case how it was impossible for him to have actually done it. They decided not to report that. And similarly, they've decided not to report, in this case, why she couldn't possibly have done it. Now you could argue, oh, they don't want to bias people, but they're also not being fair or just or accurate. And this is a problem. Now, do we blame the media for that? Well, the media are there to sell papers, they sell whatever they're selling in relation to their media things, whether it's digital subscriptions or, you know, ad revenue, whatever it might be. They want to get people interested as much as possible. And people decided that she was guilty the moment that she gave that interview to a current affair, before she was charged with anything, before anyone had died. And they believed, based on the way she conducted herself in that interview, that she was guilty. And that's the end of the story. And that's unfortunately the problem. Current affair do have a habit of making people look more guilty than they are, and they're well known for it. They just surprise people. They go, "Ha ha, gotcha," and then edit things to make them look more guilty than they are. And unfortunately, a lot of people that have looked at that haven't really taken into account that a current affair do tend to lie and exaggerate a lot, and very commonly, and they've had court cases about it, where they're known to have inaccurate journalism in relation to that sort of thing. Sensationalist journalism, and people haven't really paid attention to that, and they've just focused on that and only that, and not worried about anything else. So this is the reality in Australia, that I think that because we have this system, there's a greater chance of her being found guilty than in a system where, for example, America, where they didn't have this system. But it's still not a perfect system, because there is the chance there will be. Now, the media have been, a lot of media outlets have been in trouble in relation to their coverage of this court case because of how they've covered it, and because it might influence the jury, even though the jury's not allowed to look at the media, just in case they did. So they've got all these laws and people are still disobeying them anyway. It's not a perfect system, but at least we're trying, I suppose. You know, there was a Kyle and Jackie O show on radio recently, got a notice from the court saying that they can't report in the way that they were. We had ABC's Mushroom podcast daily, and that was on YouTube basically. They got in trouble for how they reported on it. And there was a mummy blogger one that said, well, she got in trouble for blogging about it on the internet, just writing about it. And she said it wasn't even her, it was the people writing in comments, that she reported on it accurately, but the comments were not accurate. And because of that, she got served a legal notice. And so there is significant evidence of media corruption in this case that is trying to find her guilty and trying to influence the outcome. There's significant evidence of that, and it's all one way, just so you know. There is no suggestion that anyone is trying to find her not guilty when she is guilty. I know some people might say, oh, well, I'm doing that. I'd argue I'm not. I'm just trying to be factual, but because of how much media manipulation and bias there is in this case, as there was in the George Pell case, we are in a situation where someone reporting accurately about it is in trouble. And we certainly saw that with the George Pell case, and we still got, like, he was found not guilty on appeal, and still people to this day, the majority of media still claim he was guilty, even though there was no question that he was not, even though it was not possible for him to be guilty, not even just a theoretical, there was no theoretical chance he was guilty. And I'd say that's the same situation here. So it's not an ideal situation. The fact that it's possible for someone to be found guilty of something they could not possibly have committed does mean it's a flawed process. It's quite honestly not debatable that she couldn't have done this. In a similar way, so it was not debatable that George Pell could not have done the crime he was accused of. So, this is, I mean, she did other things. Well, she definitely hid the dehydrator, she's admitted to that, and that is a crime. And you could go to jail for that crime of lying to police about that. And I'd argue, you know, she probably should have been charged with that and gone to jail for 3-4 months maybe. In a similar way, George Pell was guilty of some other crime, the crime of covering up somebody else's crime. And he could have gone to jail for that. But he wasn't guilty of doing anything himself, at least certainly not on that occasion. And in a similar way, Erin Patterson in this case definitely did not cook 6 separate beef Wellingtons. There's no possibility of that, and given that how essential that is for any chance of her being found guilty overall, she cannot have done the rest of it, because she definitely ate the same meal as they did. And there's no question about that. Now, did she poison them? She did. Could it have been accidental, or was it definitely on purpose? If it was definitely on purpose, she was aiming to kill herself. And okay, if she was aiming to kill herself but took the risk of vomiting later, that's the worst you can have. But she definitely did it, and then vomited up later after eating a dodgy cake, aiming to not die because she'd done that. That's the most you can say that she did. And that's such a thin line, there's no possibility realistically. Anyway, so that's what we do in Australia. It's not a perfect system, but that's what we do to try to have a fair trial. It's not the perfect system. Obviously, the George Pell case proves that it doesn't always work, but hopefully, and I am hopeful, that she is found not guilty. I do think she probably will be found not guilty. And if she is found not guilty, I don't think there's any way that it will be appealed. Anyway, that's it for me. Bye-bye now.